Thank you all very much. I am Schuyler Towne. I am a security anthropologist and research scholar at the Ronan Institute. And the talk that I'm giving today is the culmination of 4 years of research into the origins of the lock. This began when I was attempting to write up the history of the lock based on things that I had heard from people in my community, from books that I had read on security engineering and in encyclopedias and whatnot. And for some reason, it just hit me that it didn't seem quite right. I didn't know where to go from there, but I've had amazing help from other researchers along the way. So we're going to dig into all of that, but before we do, I would just like to dedicate this talk to Barry Wells, Han Fei, and Eric Schmiedel, who were my first and finest teachers when I got involved in all things locks. Not be here if it weren't for those fellows. So, when you first start to look into the history of the lock, you will immediately start finding references to a 4,000-year-old Egyptian lock. Locks were used as far back as 4,000 years ago in Egypt. You'll find this all over the place. So before we dig into what the true origins might be, some of the evidence around that, I think it's important to understand how we got here to this fact of the 4,000-year-old Egyptian lock. We're going to talk about the rediscovery. So Vivant Denon was an interesting dude. He was a playwright, he wrote novellas, he was a fantastic illustrator and etcher, and he was even a diplomat for a while under a couple of different kings of France. He was stationed in St. Petersburg, Russia, as the secretary to the diplomat of France there. And his service was described as he conducted diplomacy and love affairs concurrently, deceiving his mistresses for his masters. He was fishing out state secrets in the most frequented alcoves. Adaptable, discreet, and cunning in this extremely difficult role, he made himself liked everywhere and by everyone. And that, not just for his diplomatic service, but for his entire life, is a perfect way to sum the guy up. Vivant Denon not only survived, but thrived in every era of revolutionary France. He was a favorite of Louis XV. He went back into diplomatic service for Louis XVI. When Louis was getting beheaded, he returned to France, even though he had been put on the let's kill this guy and give his property away list, and immediately ingratiated himself to the Reign of Terror government. He was doing etchings of the uniforms that their civil servants were going to use in the new regime. And when all of those guys were getting killed, somehow he managed to make the acquaintance of Josephine. Josephine, Napoleon's #1 lady, introduced him to Napoleon. And when Napoleon went to Egypt, Vivant saw that this was going to be the opportunity of a lifetime. He had already contributed a lot to the arts, a lot of art history stuff. He was in Italy for a long time. When he found out that not only was Napoleon going to Egypt, but Napoleon was gathering his corps de savants, a group of dozens and dozens of artists, academics, scientists, psychiatrists, to travel through Egypt with the main military force in order to document all of the culture, the art, the antiquities, so on and so forth. This wasn't just an attempt to conquer Egypt. This was an attempt to completely appropriate all that Egypt was. And Napoleon was particularly effective about that over the years. So Vivant was perhaps getting a little bit claustrophobic in this large contingent of other academics when he was traveling with the main army, but he saw his opportunity to split off from the main army and head into Upper Egypt. Upper Egypt hadn't been well explored. We'll talk a little bit about the history of that. But the reason that he was able to do this was because of the Mamluk Beys. Now, I would love to go into an exhaustive history of the Mamluk. They are absolutely amazing. The short version is around 900. They were a slave caste that were kidnapped from foreign countries and trained to be an elite military force that were given station above the regular citizens of that particular empire. About 200 years later, they overthrew their rulers, and they had a 400-year caliphate. They maintained the slavery system. You couldn't have second generational property. Your sons were not able to acquire anything that you had built in your lifetime. It was just another group of slaves. Anyway, remarkable group of people, and I should cut it off there because really we only need to go back 3 generations for context. Okay. Ali Bey al-Kabir revolts against the Ottoman Empire, who had been controlling the Mamluks and their people for quite a long time. In the process, he manages to conquer a huge area. Unfortunately, his acolyte, Muhammad Bey Abu al-Dahab, immediately, just a couple of years later, betrays him and returns everything to the Ottomans. Then, Murad Bey and Ibrahim Bey, Muhammad Bey's acolytes, form a duumvirate. So Ibrahim was in charge of everything diplomatic, everything to do with the state and affairs, finance, blah, 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 and Murad was the military leader. Now, the reason that we go all the way back to Ali Bey al-Kabir was because when he revolted, he also opened up relations with Europe. He reignited an interest in Europe in this area because he brought in traders that hadn't had access before. He brought in weaponry and military. And Napoleon, when he saw his opportunity, set his sights right on this area as the first step in an eventual plan to get to India and overthrow the British Tea Company. Yeah, thank you. Unfortunately, none of that worked. So, Murad Bey and Ibrahim Bey, probably as a result of these dual revolts in the people immediately above them, what they end up doing actually is just sort of controlling Egypt and giving lip service to the Ottomans. And the Ottomans were getting sick of it, and they actually came in and attempted to drive them out. So the Beys briefly separate, but by the time Napoleon arrives, they are in control of that country. Their Mamluk house is in complete control of Egypt. So at the Battle of the Pyramids, they are destroyed. Not completely destroyed. Ibrahim takes off for the Sinai Peninsula, and Murad Bey takes off into Upper Egypt. So a small contingent under Louis Desaix, in July 21st, 1798, go after Murad Bey in Upper Egypt. Now at that time, Denon wasn't able to follow immediately, but Denon, realizing that there was this new small contingent that had none of the other scholars attached to it that was going deep into Upper Egypt, he, the next chance he got, attached himself to Augustin Belliard, who in November the same year caught up to Desaix, and they were chasing after Murad Bey together. Now, Murad Bey was a guerrilla cavalryman. He was just taking off. He would camp out for a while. They were on a ridiculous schedule that wasn't going to work to Denon's favor, but he got to see things that almost no one before him, at least no one from Europe, had the opportunity to see before. Now, there were some Europeans who made it into Upper Egypt. Throughout the 1700s, there were a few people going in and writing small travelogues of their journeys through there, though on reflection in the 19th century, scholars looking back at their work found that there were a lot of things where maps were just incorrect, illustrations they got back and descriptions they got back were, if not suspect, at least somewhat amateurish. There were people doing great work. There are some amazing things that came out of some of these guys' efforts. But I just want to make it clear that though there were people there before, what Denon winds up doing is on a completely other level. So Denon was brought into this not just for his academic prowess, but also because he was such a good illustrator, and they wanted somebody out there drawing the battlefields, you know, the glory of France, drawing the military, so on and so forth. But more and more, his concerns were with the actual antiquities of Egypt. And these are both etchings of Denon's. Now, as I was saying, Denon was traveling with a force that was taking off after a guerrilla cavalry force. They were traveling all over the place. They would sometimes camp out for days in the middle of the desert with nothing to look at. They would sometimes be rolling right past amazing artifacts and amazing temples without Denon being able to stop for a second. So for quite a while, they were camped out near El Araba. And Denon says to Desaix, hey, whatever happens, I need to get like 1 mile that way at some point with you guys having my back so I can draw these monuments, blah, blah, blah. And Desaix said, don't worry about it. As soon as Belliard gets back, we're going to crush Murad and da-da-da-da-da-da. And then a couple of weeks later, they head out. They never went to El Araba, and they are riding by these 2 massive monuments. And Denon recounts this Desay dared not look me in the face. If I am killed tomorrow, said I to him, my ghost will be always haunting you, repeating in your ears, El Araba, El Araba. So Denon's time out there wasn't the best, but what he managed to get accomplished was fantastic. And though this is one of my favorite anecdotes from his travelogue, the soldiers were incredibly devoted to the work that he was trying to do as much as they could be. When they did arrive to a site, soldiers would get on their knees and allow him to use their backs as drawing boards. They would stand above him just to shade him from the sun so that he could get his work done. So they were very committed to what he was trying to do, but this was a difficult situation for both parties. So in July 1799, this is the that we care about as Locke people. They arrive at Karnak. Now, Karnak is a massive temple. We'll look at the scale of it. But when he arrives, he had done some work there before, and he takes the opportunity to introduce the new soldiers that he's with to some of what he sees around him, and he takes the opportunity to look around for new interesting things. He describes on a wall seeing an offering of 2 obelisks, a gate for a town, and that gate, as his translator, Arthur Aiken, says, was shut by exactly the same kind of wooden bolts that are at present made use of. But when you actually look back at the original French, he wasn't using the word bolt. That word is lock. Denon was seeing a lock on that wall. Now, seeing the lock, seeing the obelisks, seeing the door, Denon says, we can infer from these sculptures that obelisks and such kind of monuments were the votive offerings of princes and other great personages, and that even less monumental objects, such as doors, were also pious offerings. And then Aiken drops one of the most beautiful sentences this guy ever says. This isn't in the original, the English translation. And that such utilitarian objects are transmitted by a tradition that runs through all revolutions of nations. That this lock that he is seeing around him in use in Egyptian huts, in the small communities that he was in, he was seeing the exact same thing that were in the communities around him, carved into an ancient wall. He says, the image I give of an absolutely modern lock can stand in as a drawing of the ancient one, as I did not notice any different. So unfortunately, he was so hot at Karnak that he wasn't able to draw the wall that he was looking at. But he did provide us with these illustrations. Now, these 5 drawings are the reason that you have a pin tumbler lock on your door right now. When his journals were published in France, it made a huge stir. And then when they were translated into English 4 different times over the course of about 6 years, because each translator thought they could do it better than the other, and then he published his own version. His travelogue in 3 volumes with the plates, with all of his descriptions. The Egyptian revival movement, there was some Egyptian architecture that people were playing with, but the Egyptian revival movement exploded in art, architecture, fashion, everything. And these 5 little drawings, when brought to England, ignited a new debate in the security community there. As W. Nicholson put it in a Journal of Natural Philosophy, Chemistry, and the Arts, the simplicity and other advantages of this lock are too obvious to require much remark. And this was unlike anything that they had seen before. He goes on, I shall confine my present observations to its degree of security or inviolability. We may admit that the ancient lock, with many pins falling independently of each other, cannot be picked or opened without its key. Now, if there be a number of these pins so placed and adjusted as to fall into their respective sockets at the position of the bolt when shut, if their lower tails be of different lengths, and a key be made to correspond with them, and lift them all to the proper height at once, the combination will be such as cannot be made out by any impression or tentative process upon the lock itself. Tentative process is the term for tension and manipulation lockpicking that we teach you, or was back then at least. Let's have one more look at those illustrations. So, these were fixed length pegs that were pushing small pegs up into what we would now think of as the Bible of the lock, but really was just the housing of a staple. The bolt would run through that staple into the wall, the pins would fall down into the bolt, and that key would lift them out of the way and it would pull it right out. This was unlike anything that the European world had been dealing with for a very long time. Warded locks had been all the rage for centuries and centuries. This was sea change for them. And at the time, they thought that this was incredibly secure. And as this guy describes, I mean, the changes that this man describes in 1804 become your lock. Instead of having those fixed length pins, he says, if their lower tails be of different lengths, then a key made to correspond with them and lift them all to the proper height at once. The combination will be such as cannot be made out by impression. Of course, we know that now it can. Or tentative process. Of course, we know now that it can upon the lock itself. In 1805, we see the first implementation of a pin lock. This is Abraham Oger Stansbury. This is actually really right in line with the Egyptian lock. That's a spinning plate that has a series of holes cut out of it. There is a leaf spring, which you'll see in the lower left, that has a fixed length peg on it. Those leaf springs push up into the holes in the disc. You'll have a key with a series of pegs that match the pattern of the disc. Push that in, you push all the leaf springs back, and now you can rotate that roller that will throw the bolt. So still fixed length, really right in line with the Egyptian lock. This slide is from Alfred C. Hobbs' fantastic work on locks and lockpicking throughout the ages. He also, and this is with quite a bit of foresight at this point, covers how he would have attempted to pick the Egyptian lock. So he just has a straight pick there, and he describes that he would put pressure on the bolt while lifting up the pins. All of this sounds incredibly familiar, I hope. And the bolt is able to come free. But still, at the time, this was remarkable. And Linus Yale Sr. winds up making the closest thing that you would think of as a modern pin tumbler lock in, I think, maybe 1844. This is actually his original patent model for that lock. And then his son, Linus Yale Jr., 15 or 20 years later, comes up with the modern pin tumbler lock. It rotates, the cam operates on the bolt instead of the key directly, so on and so forth. And all of this was directly inspired by Vivant Denon's refinding of this carving in the wall. And now you find pin tumbler locks all over the world. So you can understand why, with such an incredible connection to the pin tumbler lock, that we would take Vivant's word for that 4,000 years, right? Okay, so let's disrupt that a little bit. Denon, throughout his travelogue, says things like, these runes were waiting for me for 4,000 years. He refers to 4,000 years a lot. Napoleon, in giving speeches to his men, says things like, from these monuments yonder, 40 centuries look down upon you. This idea of the Egyptian runes just being, as a whole, 4,000 years old was just the thing to say. You see this repeated a lot, not just from these two guys, but in other literature of the time. Now, what Denon says really specifically that really nails this for us, when talking, this is from the description of the actual plate. I have placed it among the antiquities because it is the same as that which was used there for 4,000 years, that I have found sculpted among the reliefs adorned on the great temple of Karnak. So he literally says, this lock is 4,000 years old. But Egypt went on for a really long time. A really long time. The art on this, which is from very early Egyptian civilization, around 3100 BCE, the art on this, the figures, the systems of government, religion, so on and so forth, while there were great revolutions within that community, if you were to drop in at any point in Egyptian history, you would recognize it as ancient Egypt. This from 3,000 years later. Same style of figures, same style of art. So when they're saying 4,000 years, they're encompassing 3,000 years of history in that. Incredibly inaccurate. Now at Karnak itself, just Karnak, that developed over the course of nearly 1,000 years, just that one site. And Karnak was enormous. Karnak went on for so long, that the position of the water changed and went away. They were able to build out larger and larger areas. There were 30 different heads of state that were involved in construction at Karnak. So even being able to find out where he was looking and what time that would correspond to starts to become difficult, especially because ruins continue to be ruined. He was looking at this more than 200 years ago, and unfortunately in that time, a lot more destruction has taken place. A very small example, in 1899, there was a domino-like collapse of a series of columns at Hypostyle Hall. They never stop getting wrecked. Now, thankfully, he said to us, I saw an offering of 3 obelisks, a door on a gate, and that gate was secured by a lock that I see all around me. And he says that, and we might think, oh, I saw that here, I saw that here, I saw that here. But then he clarifies for us, thankfully, that he can interpret this collection of items as meaning that all of these things had a ritual significance. So we now know that all of these things were involved in that offering. He wasn't just saying an offering of 2 obelisks and these other 2 things. It was an offering of 2 obelisks, a temple gate, and a lock. So we know that they go together, and thankfully, Elaine Sullivan at the Digital Karnak Project in UCLA, when I sent her that block of text, said, oh, I think he was looking at this. So this is Thutmose III offering 2 obelisks on an interior wall of Hesteptut's Palace of Mat. So, to put this into context with the rest of the facility, that red area is the palace. So, it's a really small area in the context of the rest of the site, but what we know for sure was that it was built around 1470 BCE. And while this isn't a huge, haha, I gotcha, we do have to correct him to say that this had been waiting for him for 3,200 years. So now we've gained 800 years on the guy, right? So what can we do with that? We need to start exploring some alternative origin theories. What I will propose, and I'm not the first to propose it, is that the Egyptian lock was actually present in Mesopotamia. So we're just going to go northeast a little bit. And again, I am not the first person to say that they had complex locks. There are a lot of people. In 1843, Botta actually finds parts of a complex lock in Khorsabad. Austin Henry Layard finds, I believe, a brass key for a pin-tumbler lock in Koyunjik. Daniel T. Potts, who will be very important to this paper, wrote a fantastic piece in 1990 that we'll be exploring, arguing for complex locks in Mesopotamia. Andreas Fuchs in Finland made a fantastic recreation of a complex pin-tumbler lock from Mesopotamia. David and Joan Oates found the oldest artifact of a lock ever, which was in Mesopotamia. Bert Vanderspeck and Irving Finkel argued for court positions related to pin-tumbler locks, and Karen Radner codified this and gave it a name. So I am not here saying that they had complex locks. What I am here saying is that they had them first. So, David and Joan Oates, they devoted their lives to Nimrud, a fantastic old site in Mesopotamia. They were there digging, I believe, in the 50s and continued going back and doing additional research on finds that were happening throughout the rest of their lives. I believe that David has passed away, but Joan is still with us. And this is a drawing of a locking plate that would accept 3 pins dropping through it. And where they found this and the context that they found it in puts it as the oldest lock artifact that we have ever seen. Now, our lock artifacts don't go back 4,000 years. Our lock artifacts go back 2,800 years, almost 3,000 years. So what we're seeing carved in the walls and what we will later look into in the linguistics are where we're really going to dig in to try to make our point. But oldest piece found in Mesopotamia, and earlier this month, Nimrud was leveled by ISIS. And they had many more locks. And this obviously is important for all sorts of reasons, but yeah, this was frustrating. So, Daniel Potts, a fantastic Egyptologist, Assyriologist with an incredibly long, amazing career who recently took a position, I believe, at New York University. He had been out in Australia for quite a long time. He published a paper back in 1990 that was called Lock and Key in Ancient Mesopotamia. The typesetter accidentally wrote it as Locky and Key. The name of the journal was just Mesopotamia. It was Italian. It was very difficult to track this down, but when I did, it was the first real clue that I had that somebody else out there was saying, I'm pretty sure that this was going on a lot longer ago than any of us thought. So the way that he has proposed to solve this puzzle is by looking at a constellation of terms that he was seeing come up in the cuneiform over and over and over again. They were always appearing together, and the current researchers of his time were saying that these terms referred to bolts, they referred to doors, they maybe referred to hinges, handles, but that there were no complex locks at the time that these things were being written, so they could not possibly be applied to that. So literally all he did was he said, listen, I am going to take this constellation of terms, I'm going to assume this more complex model, the Egyptian lock, and we're going to lay these in there and see what happens. So, first he has the Ashkutu, Shigaru, and Sikaru. All three of these, he argues, are synonyms for the bolt. They appear with the other terms that we're going to look at very frequently, and they almost never appear together. So he thinks they're just synonyms. Then we have the Upu. These are our pin chambers, and this just meant hole, basically, but in this context, it's our pin chambers. The Namzaku, this is, again, what we would now think of as the Bible of the lock, the housing of the lock. This, for them, was just the lock, the main component. The Mushalu, the key, and finally, Sikatu, the pins in the lock. Doing this, he went back through a couple of other translations that had relied on this constellation of terms, and he just corrected them in his paper. He said, if we follow what I'm doing here, it makes more sense. One great example of this is this, lines 7 through 15 are... Lines 7 through 15 are a technical request, basically. They sent a letter saying, hey, our locks don't work. Every time we do this, this happens, and they're not functioning for us anymore. We need somebody to fix the locks. So the way that, we're going to look at line 10 here, which is sort of the crux of the argument. The way the Chicago Assyrian Dictionary, section E, page 133, reads this as, if the bit of the key of the temple of Istar is lifted and lies on top of the handle of the lock, something goes wrong. So if we think about what the cat is saying here, they're saying if the key is set on top of the handle, it doesn't work. Well, it wouldn't work because that doesn't make any sense. That doesn't operate a lock. Using Potts's new arrangement of these terms, he suggests that this line says, if the pin of the lock of the Temple of Istar is lifted and the top of the hole of the bolt, it goes on to say that when we lift up the pins with our key, they don't redescend because they're getting misaligned and lying on top of the bolt. So by adopting this new model, he was able to go through not just this, but several blocks of text that had been previously translated and make them make sense. So this is a strong linguistic argument for the existence of the pin lock. The pins, the sikatu of the lock, the nemzaku, weren't in alignment with the pin chambers and the upu of the bolt, the ishkutu. So now that we have a potential new origin, now that we have this linguistic connection, I think that we can demonstrate a progression of technology, whereas we've never been able to do that in the Egyptian theory. With the Egyptian theory, when we look back at this, we just say, oh man, they have these locks today, looks like they had them 4,000 years ago, who knows what came before. In the Mesopotamian theory, we have a really strong, very important precursor. Elsewhere at Karnak, we have this series of reliefs. What you can see in the second panel is that he is pulling a peg out of a wall. What he's doing is he is opening the seal of this door. He's opening the door seal. So Mesopotamian door seals were around for a very long time. The way that this worked is that you would have ropes coming out of a door to secure it. You would then run them into this, put a peg through it right into the wall in a slot for that peg, and then seal it over with more clay. And this was just a seal. It had an intricate design on it, and the only way to free those ropes was to break the seal. Once the seal was broken, somebody knew at least that you had been in there, whether or not it was able to directly stop you. So, door seals have been around for an incredibly long time. This is Towne Bakun A, and the A period, Bakun A, was from about 4460 to 4340 BCE. This turns out to be an incredibly complex, if small, community. This is a layout of not only rooms that they lived in, but also rooms that were dedicated just to warehousing goods that they were creating. And they protected those warehoused goods with door seals. Pardon me. So this was an illustration by the author of the paper this is referencing, demonstrating how the door sealing and unsealing might have taken place. Now, importantly, he describes that there would also be a human there. Locks, even door seals, the most basic forms of mechanical security, were always meant as a second layer. This is defense in depth. Here are a few fragments of the door seals from Tel Bakun A. You can see some of the patterns of the ceilings in these, and by taking all of these together, you can recreate what the seals would have actually looked like. Now, I love this quote. Door ceilings may be taken as the earliest tangible evidence of the evolutionary transition from a tribal society to a civilized society. Abbas argues that the practice of sealing certain buildings implies a kind of social contract, which would be respected by the members of the community and whose breach may bring punishment to the offender. The fact that the door ceilings existed meant that there was some sort of authority behind them, that there was some sort of organizing structure to their community, that their community was perhaps as part of an organization of other larger communities, that there was trade happening, that the existence of these mechanical precautions really were the harbingers of a transition into actual civilization. This is the cuneiform for lockmaster. Karen Radner, in an amazing paper called The Lockmasters and Gatekeepers of Ancient Mesopotamia, took some of the work of Daniel Potts, took some of the work of some of the other researchers that I've mentioned, and she said, we know that we've had gatekeepers attested to for palaces. We know that we've had guards. We know that we have had people attested to that literally were just supposed to stand at doors and be the human barrier of entry. But we have this other term that keeps appearing and that we're not defining well enough, and I propose that it means lockmaster. She describes this position as a person that would actually be in charge of the pins of the lock. They would be in charge of the pins and the keys. They would be the only one that could apply a lock to a door, and they would be the only one that could unlock it. So even if you have a guard dealing with your human traffic and saying, yes, this person can come in, it takes that second factor of the lockmaster to come in and actually open the lock for you. So if one person is corrupt, if one person is bribed, if one person is murdered, you still have the backup of the lock, which is under the domain of the lockmaster, who would not be in that same place at that same time. He would have to be called to open it. What's really important here is sikate, Rab sikate. This is the plural of sikatu, the pins in the lock. The name for the peg in the door seal was also sikatu. As Karen Radner says, the very fact that the words were the exact same, that we have this linguistic connection, would imply that there was an evolutionary connection between them as well. In her paper, she says that Suzanne Herbert, when studying the 565 Neo-Assyrian clay ceilings from Nineveh, was unable to identify a single example of a door ceiling. So they had all sorts of seals, but she found no door ceilings there. Karen believes that this would indicate that the system was no longer in use at the time. The door seals were no longer in use at Nineveh, and she believes that that was because it was replaced by the Sikatu lock. So I reached out to her directly as I was getting really excited about this point, and Karen, just like Suzanne and Daniel, got back to me immediately, enthusiastically, and when I said, could we say that the lock was invented by the time we saw these words and by the last time that we saw these ceilings, she told me that the title of Rab Sikate was already attested to in Old Babylonian as old as 1800 BCE. And that the last clay ceilings that they had found from large collections of door ceilings were around 2500. So our last artifacts of door seals that are currently in the record from around 2500 BCE, the title of Lockmaster, not just references to the parts of the lock, but the actual codified title, is already showing up in 1800 BCE. So what we know is that somewhere between 2500 BCE and 1800 BCE, the lock came into existence, and I believe that it came into existence in Mesopotamia. Now that's a huge range, right? But I think we're going to close the gap. There are more than 250,000 cuneiform texts that have been found. More than 250,000. Those include 13 million or more words. There is more cuneiform being studied than the entire corpus of Latin. There are 3 million more words known right now that people are looking into, that are trying to understand, than we have of all of Latin history. There aren't a lot of people working on it, so it might be a while before we close the gap. But they're doing amazing work, and I wouldn't be able to do any of this without them. So I genuinely believe that both from finding new artifacts as sites are continuing to be uncovered, and through the linguistic channels as well, that we will ever tighten this gap until we have a really good idea of when the lock came into existence. And when we know when, we can start to think about why. And if you'll indulge me, I would like to read you a passage from a lament for Sumer and They were destroyed by war and flood, and the author of the lament is describing the scene. This is particularly evocative to me because throughout this research, I have come to quite passionately believe that locks are inherently human. They are tied directly to every attempt that we have at a society, at culture, that locks, before any other system of law, of policing, of anything else, that locks always come before, and that locks give us room to build society. That locks from time immemorial have borne the burden of social order. Large axes were sharpened in front of The spears, the arms of battle were prepared. The large bows, throw sticks, and shields gathered together to strike. The barbed arrows covering its outer side like a raining cloud. Large stones fell together with great thuds. Daily, the evil wind returned to the city. Confident in its own strength, stood ready for the murderers. But its people, oppressed by the enemy, could not withstand their weapons. In the city, those who had not been felled by weapons succumbed to hunger. Hunger filled the city like water. It would not cease. This hunger contorted people's faces, twisted their muscles. Its people were as if drowning in a pond. They gasped for breath. Its king breathed heavily in his own palace. The glory of the palace, which was once so lovely, was extinguished. Like a storm that fills all the lands, it was built there like twilight in the heavens, its doors adorned with the heavenly stars. Its great bronze latches were secured, You could not hear the door being latched. The door went unlatched. There was no one left to lock it. Thank you. Thank you. I very much, before I take questions, have to acknowledge the help of a number of people. Karen Radner, Daniel Potts, and Elaine Sullivan. I wouldn't have been able to get started on this. I wouldn't have been able to continue on this if every time I reached out to these people as just some guy sitting in his bedroom late at night saying, hey, I read this paper and I think it's neat, can you tell me more? Daniel Potts got back to me within an hour. Karen Radner and Elaine Sullivan both got back to me within a day with encouragement, new information, with specifics, other papers. They were amazing. Debbie Chakra, Molly Sauter, and Andrew Sempier are phenomenal friends of mine who have helped me work through the last stages of this, understand how to present it, understand how to structure it, and understand what it all means. And in particular, what I really appreciate is that they not only encouraged but never tried to tone down my ludicrous enthusiasm and emotional connection to this material. I don't think that I would have followed this for 4 years if I didn't believe so passionately in what locks mean. John Wilkins and all of my colleagues at the Ronan Institute, they champion independent scholarship, they give resources, and they provide a community for independent scholars to do the work that they love and believe in, and I am incredibly grateful to them. My citations will begin, but does anyone have any questions? Yes? Excellent. So the question is, looking back at this past work, the locks are the foundation of society. How does that inform my feelings about encryption and the fight for the legal and easy access to encryption? I think that there are really strong parallels. I really do. What I believe happens with locks, and particularly regularly, we see it in door seals originally. We see it, I believe, in the transition to locks. Hopefully I'll get to dig more into that someday. And we see it in particular, and in a more modern light, in the Great Lock Controversy of 1851. What locks do for us is they provide us the room to develop the other systems that create a civil society and a social order. If you cut off the ability to secure yourself, your community, your person, whether that's mechanically or whether that's digitally, you prevent the opportunity for the development of other incredibly important systems that society needs to function. If we really want to have an efficient, a collaborative, a safe digital life, I genuinely believe that encryption must come first, because it needs to be there for us to build all of the other structures so that when the encryption finally fails, like the locks finally fail all the time, all of the other systems will now be in place. Thank you. Yes? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the question is, if we're looking back at particularly textual evidence of society, which do I think will come first, the lock or the society? So we don't have much in the way of text except for the ceilings and some of what we've been able to, sorry, I say we. This is one guy in particular, and he's in Chicago, and he's amazing, and he was in my citations, and he's incredible, the guy that was looking at Tel Ibukune. His main argument was that Tel Ibukune was the transition from like agricultural communities to organized state-oriented societies. And while the key-based lock might not have been there at that time, he argues quite explicitly that this community was that turning point, and that it could not have been there without the door seal, without that first mechanical sealing. So when we look back at these texts, we find references to locks, we find references to door sealings, we find references to the pegs that are put through it. And so far, they seem to run hand in hand. Tel Ibakune, very well argued, appears to be that first transitory moment to a potential organization of state, a potential organization of society, and the door seal was there right at the moment that that happened. So I think that they are linked directly. Yes? It's a very good question. The question was, were locks developed in ancient China independently, separately? This is one of the big things that I want to do with another chunk of my life at some point in time. There are a couple of wonderful researchers in Taiwan that I have reached out to who will hopefully be able to help me tread some of those waters. What I can say is that we know that a lot of the technology, culture, art, etc. that was developing in the Fertile Crescent was going in each direction, right? So we have some continental Europeans, we have some Africans, we also have the Far East. I mean, this whole area is called Near East Studies as a whole. So we do know that technology would travel in that direction. I can't offer a strong enough opinion about that right now, but I'm very curious to see how much independent development there was, how much was inspired by some of what was going on here at this time, and I think that that's going to be another rich, multi-year part of my research life at some point, I hope. Thank you for the question. Anyone else? Yes?
What's the earliest instance of someone bypassing a lock surreptitiously?
Oh, that's a really good question. What's the earliest instance of someone bypassing a lock surreptitiously? I don't know the answer to that right now, and I think that this is maybe one of the most revelatory moments of me being more of an academic than a lockpicker now. I had to pick a lock for my father recently, and I was having a hard time. He was like, "Oh, don't worry about it." I said, I'm not that much of an academic, I'll get it. And I did, thankfully. It was like 5 pin quicks, it was a disaster. Anyway, I don't know the answer to that. I have these technical accounts of, we have a temple that lost a key and they needed their key replaced. We have the locks that were no longer functioning correctly. I don't know of the first time that one was defeated surreptitiously. We have descriptions of destructive attacks on locks and gates. We have many descriptions of destructive entry, as a matter of fact. In the various laments, if you want to read some of the most gut-wrenching, tragic poetry, just look up these laments for Sur, Umer, I think Eridu, a few others. They are epic, they are hundreds and hundreds of lines long, and they're all just as their faces contorted with hunger, that sort of stuff. A lot of them reference, they ripped the hinges off. They did this, they did that as a means of gaining entry to these locked doors. But I don't know of any surreptitious accounts yet. I will keep an eye out. Yes? Adam points out that it might be one of the, similar to why we have trouble finding appropriate stats on entry now, that it may just not be investigated and reported. In particular, I doubt that there is much forensic tradition at this moment in time. But I also think that it's worth remembering that these were human mechanical systems. These weren't supposed to be left completely alone.
They kept their job, I bet, because they knew when the lock was jammed up how to not destructively get it to keep working.
I think that is a fantastic point. That those in the upper classes were probably keeping their jobs because they knew how to open these locks. That is, yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly. Oh, real quick, I do, and I don't have a reference to it right now, but I do know of an instance where somebody had developed a system where they would seal something with their ring and then throw their ring into the thing that they had sealed, break it open, and then retrieve their ring, thinking, oh, well, my ring is in there, so they can't make a new sealing of it, which is obviously dumb. And his servant started stealing from him by breaking the seal, taking whatever they wanted to out of the hoard and then resealing it with a ring and throwing it back in. So we do know about that, but that was Roman, so not nearly as old. Yes? Warded locks, and around like 1500 we start seeing what are called spring locks, but they're basically the same thing as warded locks. It wasn't a huge change, and this all continues until around 1770 when there start being massive waves in security, which works out really nicely for the moment that Denon comes around as well. I mean, all of these things really fit together really cleanly for us to finally have wound up with this lock. Getting into the depths of warded locks and some of their variations isn't great, but I don't have time for that right now. But suffice it to say that the Egyptian lock, on its face, more secure than a warded lock. After the decline of the Roman Empire, other than small localized communities, we mostly lost the technology in the rest of the world. Yes? What kind of locks were being used in the ancient Western world? We know that if you look particularly at Rome, one of the reasons that we have warded locks is because Rome started down a different path of development, which was actually still a little bit better than the traditional warded lock, but eventually became the warded lock because their keys were this big, and a warded lock key, you can have it be that big. As far as Greece, I'm not 100% sure, but it was very much informed by a lot of this. Yes? No? Anyone else? Thank you all so much. I loved getting to present this to you. Thank you. Thank you, Carolina Con. Thank you all.